Deserve certainly the most extreme punishment society has, and I think society deserves to be protected from me and from others like me, that's for sure. Each time I'd harm someone, each time I'd kill someone, there'd be an enormous amount, especially at first, enormous amount of horror, guilt, remorse afterwards.
The clock ticks down, each passing second dragging Ted Bundy closer to his inevitable end. Jim and Fred, "I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends," Ted Bundy whispered in his final moments, his words barely a whisper, almost drowned out by the deafening silence that had overtaken the room. These would be his last words before being strapped into the electric chair at Florida State Prison on January 24, 1989. Bundy, the man who had terrorized the nation, who had taken the lives of at least 36 young women, was about to face the final consequence for his actions. This wasn't just any day for Bundy. It was the day he would meet the same fate he had evaded for so long. It was the day when his long-standing manipulation, his self-crafted charm, his ability to talk his way out of almost anything, would be stripped away, leaving only a man who would have to face the reality of his monstrous actions. The man who had once said, "I'm the most cold-hearted son of a you'll ever meet," was now standing at the edge of the abyss, forced to confront the ultimate reckoning. As you hear those haunting last words, ask yourself, could this tragedy have been prevented? Do we really understand the true impact of such monstrous actions? Now, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. And if you won't subscribe, please tell us why. This story isn't just about a criminal's final moments. It's about the countless lives affected by his actions. Your voice matters in this conversation.
The day began like any other for Bundy, at least in routine, but it was anything but ordinary. Inside his cold, windowless cell, the ticking of the clock was louder than ever, each second dragging him closer to the moment that would end his life. It wasn't the morning he had ever imagined waking up to. No more courtroom appearances where he could manipulate the system, no more phone calls to his family or his attorneys, trying to postpone his date with death. No more chances to prove his innocence or fight for his life. The last hope of escaping execution had dissolved just hours earlier when the Supreme Court rejected his final appeal. The tension in the air was palpable. In the early morning hours, the walls of his cell, once so familiar, felt suffocating. There was no escaping it. The finality of the situation weighed on him like a crushing burden. As he sat there sipping his lukewarm coffee, the ritual of death row had taken on a new meaning. This was no longer just part of his life, it was the end of it, and he knew it. Outside the prison, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. A crowd had gathered, some to protest the execution, others to celebrate what they saw as justice finally served. The streets buzzed with conversations about Bundy's crimes, his charm, and the twisted narrative he had crafted for himself throughout his life. Some would mourn, but most would feel relief the monster who had terrorized the nation was about to meet his end.
But inside Bundy's cell, everything was different. The man who had once been a law student, who had represented himself in court and charmed his way out of countless sticky situations, was now powerless. His world was confined to the stark gray walls of his cell. The prison guards who had once obeyed his every word, now standing in judgment over him. And the hours were ticking away, each one bringing him closer to the execution chamber. This would not be just any execution, it would be the final chapter in a story of horror and manipulation, a chapter that many had been waiting for. Yet, as the clock inched closer to 7 a.m., Bundy had to face the harsh truth: no more manipulations, no more charm. This time, there would be no escape. Ted Bundy's name became synonymous with fear, manipulation, and unspeakable brutality. He was a man whose charming demeanor and good looks concealed a monster, a man who hid behind a mask of normalcy while committing horrific acts of violence. Bundy confessed to the murders of 36 women, though the true number of victims is suspected to be higher. His method was chillingly calculated. He would often approach his victims in public places, feigning injury or asking for help, only to overpower them and then subject them to brutal violence. His crimes spanned across several states, from Washington to Utah to Colorado. And over a period of several years, he evaded capture, leaving a trail of terror that seemed endless.
Bundy's notoriety wasn't just rooted in the brutality of his crimes. It was his ability to manipulate the justice system, the media, and even the public that set him apart. He was intelligent, articulate, and, perhaps most disturbingly, charming. He used his charm to seduce his victims and manipulate those around him. His court appearances were a spectacle in themselves, drawing media attention and public fascination. At one point, Bundy
My name is Ted Bundy, and I'm the defendant in the case, and I'm just here to introduce myself.
even represented himself in court, playing the role of both defendant and attorney, further manipulating the legal system. The media couldn't get enough of him, and his trial became a national obsession. His ability to manipulate wasn't just confined to the courtroom. Bundy played a role in cultivating his own public persona, trying to project an image of a misunderstood young man caught in a tragic series of events. He even tried to blame his violent tendencies on his addiction to pornography, claiming that it had fueled his desire to kill. Whether this was an act of deflection or a genuine attempt to explain his actions remains unclear, but the media and the public ate it up. This, coupled with his good looks and the dramatic nature of his crimes, made him an international figure, someone everyone seemed to know about, even if they weren't familiar with the grisly details. His arrest, trial, and eventual conviction brought him into the global spotlight, and for years, Bundy's case became a focal point for discussions on criminal psychology, the death penalty, and the media's role in sensationalizing criminal cases. When Bundy was finally executed in 1989, it wasn't just the end of a life, it marked the end of an era in which a criminal had managed to manipulate his way into becoming a household name.
In this video, we'll take you inside Ted Bundy's final 24 hours, an intense, gripping journey that begins with the mundane routines of his last morning on death row and builds to the chilling moment of his execution. We'll walk you through every emotional, suspenseful, and haunting detail that made his final day so remarkable. From the moment he woke up, knowing this would be his last day, Bundy's morning was thick with tension. We'll explore the emotions running through him, the last desperate appeals from his legal team, and the weight of inevitability that hung over his every move. But this wasn't just about the legal proceedings. It was about his final moments with his mother, his spiritual advisor, and even the last public interview where Bundy tried to spin his story one last time. As we break down the key moments of his last hours, we'll dive deep into the emotional side of things, his relationship with his mother, the guilt and fear he might have felt, and whether his final actions were those of a man truly seeking redemption or just another calculated manipulation. We'll also give you an insider's look at what happened behind closed doors in the lead-up to the ultimate punishment, and how Bundy's final moments affected everyone involved. This isn't just a retelling of events, it's an exploration of the human side of one of the most notorious criminals in history, and the emotional roller coaster that his final 24 hours became. You'll gain insight into what really went through Bundy's mind, and perhaps even question how we should view his last acts of life.
Ted Bundy,
one of the most notorious serial killers in American history, was convicted of the brutal murders of 36 women across multiple states in the 1970s and 1980s. His crimes spanned from Washington to Utah to Colorado, and his method of luring victims was disturbingly effective. He would often feign injury or pose as an authority figure to gain their trust, only to overpower them and subject them to unspeakable horrors. Bundy's killings were characterized by a shocking level of violence, and he became infamous not only for the brutality of his crimes, but also for his calculated ability to evade capture for so long. Bundy was arrested multiple times throughout the years, but it was his eventual capture in 1978 that brought an end to his killing spree. After a series of high-profile trials, Bundy was convicted and sentenced to death. But despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Bundy remained defiant. He used his intelligence and charisma to manipulate the justice system, at one point even representing himself in court, trying to convince jurors of his innocence. His charm and ability to deceive both the public and the legal system allowed him to delay his ultimate punishment for years. As Bundy sat on death row, his case became a nationwide obsession. His charm and his controversial claims about his crimes, particularly his assertion that his violent behavior was fueled by pornography, kept the media's attention focused on him right until the end. In the months leading up to his execution, Bundy's attorneys made several attempts to delay the inevitable. They filed numerous appeals, arguing that Bundy was mentally incompetent to be executed, but each one was swiftly denied. Bundy, the man who had once manipulated the system to his advantage, was now at its mercy.
By January 1989, as the date for his execution grew near, the media frenzy surrounding Bundy's final days reached a fever pitch. News outlets across the world were captivated by the idea of bringing closure to the nightmare Bundy had inflicted on so many. Interviews, court reports, and live updates filled the airwaves, and the public watched with a mixture of fascination and relief as Bundy's time ran out. His final days were marked not just by legal maneuvering, but also by a sense of anticipation, as people from all walks of life waited for the moment that would finally bring an end to Bundy's reign of terror. As Ted Bundy faced the final hours of his life, the question of whether he felt any remorse for his crimes loomed large. Was the man who had committed unspeakable horrors capable of genuine reflection, or was his supposed remorse merely another manipulation in his long history of deception? The truth behind Bundy's psychological state is a matter of ongoing debate even after his death. In the months leading up to his execution, Bundy's behavior seemed to shift. He had spent years on death row, a convicted killer whose charm had failed him. He had already manipulated the media, his defense team, and even the public. But now, as the countdown to his execution ticked down, Bundy faced the harsh reality of his impending death. It was at this moment that Bundy began to express a strange form of remorse. Whether his remorse was genuine or simply another layer of manipulation is difficult to determine. He claimed in interviews that he felt regret for the pain he had caused his victims' families, but the sincerity of his words was called into question by many. His history of lies, evasion, and psychological games cast doubt on whether his newfound remorse was sincere or just another calculated move. Bundy's infamous interview with James Dobson, an evangelical Christian psychologist, provides one of the clearest windows into his psychological state in the final hours. During the conversation, Bundy attempted to explain his violent impulses by blaming pornography. He claimed that his addiction to violent pornography had corrupted his mind and was the root cause of his brutal actions. It was a convenient excuse, a way for Bundy to distance himself from the full responsibility of his crimes. For many, his admission was viewed as a last-ditch effort to justify his actions and shift the blame away from himself. Whether Bundy truly believed this theory, or whether it was simply another instance of his manipulative nature, remains unclear. What is evident is that Bundy had spent much of his life avoiding full accountability for his actions, and this last-ditch attempt to explain away his crimes was another way of clinging to control, even in the face of death. Bundy's behavior throughout the trial and his time on death row was a study in contradictions. At times, he appeared cold and detached, almost clinically rational in his defense. Yet, when faced with the reality of his fate, his demeanor seemed to crack. Witnesses reported that in his final hours, Bundy showed signs of panic, a sharp contrast to the bravado he had once displayed. One of the most telling moments occurred when Bundy's attorney, Pauline Nelson, described Bundy as visibly shaken, almost in a state of near panic. His earlier arrogance, his sense of invincibility, had vanished. For a man who had once manipulated the legal system and the media to his advantage, Bundy now found himself powerless, stripped of the ability to control his narrative.
Behind each of Bundy's victims was a life, a family, a future, a series of dreams tragically cut short by one man's unthinkable violence. These women were not just statistics or names in a long list of victims. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends, each with a unique life and identity, each with a story that ended far too soon. Before Bundy's brutality turned them into victims, they were students, professionals, and young women just beginning to find their way in the world. Take, for instance, the case of 18-year-old Lisa Levy and 21-year-old Margaret Bowman, two of Bundy's victims at Florida State University. Lisa, a beautiful and intelligent young woman, had a passion for art and was attending college with plans to build a future. Margaret, a dedicated student, had just started her life as a young adult, full of hope for the future. Both were taken in brutal acts that stripped away their potential, their futures, and most painfully, the lives of their families. The families of Bundy's victims were left in shambles, often blindsided by the sudden and horrific loss of their loved ones. What began as a simple phone call, a disappearance, or a missing persons report, quickly morphed into a lifelong nightmare. Mothers and fathers were left grappling with the sudden, incomprehensible death of their daughters, and siblings were forced to contend with the hole left by the absence of a beloved family member. These families, forever altered by Bundy's actions, never had a chance to say goodbye, to offer closure, or to hold their loved ones one last time.
The impact of Bundy's crimes rippled far beyond the immediate families. His murders created a climate of fear and anxiety, especially among young women. At the time, Bundy was seen as the embodiment of the stranger danger that parents warned their children about. His ability to blend in, to appear as a trustworthy individual, created an unsettling realization that danger could come from anyone, anywhere. Communities in Washington, Utah, and Colorado were thrown into panic as women took extra precautions, fearing that the monster in their midst was still lurking, undetected, waiting for his next victim. On a national level, Bundy's killing spree captivated the media, but it also sparked conversations about women's safety, the flaws in law enforcement, and how such a monstrous individual could evade capture for so long. His crimes were a wake-up call for society, highlighting the vulnerability of women and the lengths to which a predator could go to deceive and manipulate those around him. The investigation itself became a media spectacle, with each twist and turn of Bundy's capture followed by intense scrutiny. His subsequent trials were televised, drawing millions of viewers and giving voice to the grief of his victims' families, who were forced to relive their trauma in front of the entire world. For Bundy's victims, their stories were no longer just about their lives and their dreams. They became part of a greater national conversation on violence, justice, and societal responsibility. As the country watched Bundy's trial unfold, it was a reminder that these women were more than victims. They were real people with families, hopes, and futures that would never come to fruition because of one man's horrific actions.
The legacy of Bundy's victims is a story of loss and love. Their families, in the wake of such grief, have carried their memories forward, honoring their lives in the face of an unimaginable tragedy. The communities that lived in the shadow of Bundy's terror had to rebuild a sense of security, a task that seemed insurmountable in the wake of such an unpredictable predator. And for the nation at large, Bundy's reign of terror forever changed the perception of safety and the understanding of how deeply one man's crimes can affect not just the immediate victims, but everyone within a society. In many ways, Ted Bundy's victims are the forgotten voices in the narrative of his infamy, overshadowed by the public spectacle of his capture and execution. Yet their stories, told through the voices of their families, the communities they were part of, and the profound grief that followed their deaths, are the real heart of this tragedy. The lasting impact of their loss echoes not just in the memories of those who knew them, but in the larger societal shifts that followed, reminding us that behind every murder is a person, a life interrupted, and a family forever scarred. In the final days of his life, Ted Bundy was confined to a death row cell at Florida State Prison, fully aware that his execution was imminent. As the clock ticked down, the memories of his crimes, including the brutal act that led to his ultimate arrest, haunted both him and the nation. On January 15, 1978, Bundy's reign of terror came to an end when he was apprehended by police officers in a routine traffic stop. His arrest, however, was just the beginning of the chilling revelations that would follow.
Bundy had become a master of disguise and deception, operating in plain sight, hiding in the shadows of society while committing his grisly acts of violence. The crime that led to his arrest began like many others, innocent, seemingly random, and devoid of any immediate warning signs. But Bundy's methods were far from ordinary. He often targeted young women, using his charm to lure them into his grasp. On the night of his arrest, he was pulled over by officers who noticed a car matching the description of one seen near the scene of an attack. Bundy, calm and collected as always, initially evaded suspicion, but a search of his car revealed damning evidence, items linking him directly to the brutal murder of a woman named Karen Campbell in Colorado. It was only then that police realized they had caught one of the most elusive serial killers in American history. At the time of his arrest, Bundy was still a charming, articulate man who could easily turn on the charisma that had once made him so dangerous. He was a former law student, and in the initial phases of his arrest, he appeared confident in his ability to manipulate his way out of trouble. His calm demeanor throughout the process made it clear that, in his mind, this was just another challenge to outsmart the system. But beneath the surface, Bundy's arrogance masked the horrifying reality of his actions. He had been the one to decide the fate of so many innocent women, ending their lives with a cruelty that defied logic or morality. Bundy's modus operandi was meticulously planned. He often struck at night, picking women who were alone and vulnerable. He would approach them under the guise of needing help, sometimes pretending to be injured or pretending to be a person in need of assistance. Once his victims were close enough, Bundy would overpower them, rendering them helpless with a combination of physical strength and psychological manipulation. The horrific details of his crimes were chilling in their consistency. He would sometimes abduct his victims, taking them to secluded areas where he would commit unspeakable acts of violence. Bundy's complete lack of empathy, combined with his calculated approach to each crime, made him even more dangerous. He was not only a killer, but also a predator who thrived on the fear and helplessness of his victims. As Bundy's trial unfolded, the public learned more about his gruesome methods and the cold efficiency with which he carried out his murders. The details that came to light were more than just criminal. They were a stark portrait of a man devoid of remorse. Bundy's complete lack of compassion for his victims was evident in the way he described the crimes, often minimizing the horror of his actions. In one infamous moment, during a conversation with his defense attorney,
He casually admitted to killing several women, revealing the dark ease with which he had taken their lives. Despite the mounting evidence and the overwhelming testimonies against him, Bundy never fully admitted to the extent of his violence or showed any true remorse for the pain he had caused. Bundy's final days in prison were filled with a sense of inevitability. As the clock ticked down, Bundy was forced to confront the reality of what he had done, but his ability to manipulate and control remained intact. He continued to spin his story, making last-minute attempts to delay his execution. The media frenzy surrounding his impending death reached a peak fever, and Bundy became a symbol of both evil and the complex psychology behind serial killers. However, in his final moments, Bundy was no longer the manipulative, charming killer who had once captured the world's attention. He was a broken man, facing the full weight of his actions. Though Bundy maintained his composure until the very end, there was an undeniable sense of fear that gripped him in the final moments. Witnesses described his demeanor as nervous and visibly anxious, a stark contrast to the confident and self-assured man he had once been. He had been caught, tried, and convicted for his heinous crimes, and there was no escaping the fate that awaited him. Bundy's lack of remorse throughout his life, the chilling details of his murders, and his cold approach to his victims all led to this singular moment, his execution. His story was one of manipulation, calculated violence, and ultimately, the undeniable consequences of a life built on deception and horror.
Ted Bundy's capture was the result of a series of painstaking efforts by law enforcement officers who had been chasing a phantom, one of the most elusive serial killers in history. Bundy's ability to blend into society, his charm, and his methodical approach to his crimes made him a ghost in the system. The breakthrough that ultimately led to his capture came on the night of August 16, 1975, when a Utah Highway Patrol officer, Officer Bob Hayward, pulled Bundy over for a routine traffic stop. Hayward had no idea that the man in his car was responsible for a string of brutal murders across multiple states. During the stop, the officer found burglary tools in Bundy's vehicle, prompting his arrest. At the time, Bundy was already a suspect in several unsolved disappearances, but police had no concrete evidence to link him to the crimes. His arrest was the first significant step toward unraveling the web of terror he had woven across the country. The breakthrough came when investigators linked Bundy to the abduction and murder of several women through forensic evidence, including fibers found in his car and witnesses who had seen him near crime scenes. Bundy's arrest was just the beginning, however. As law enforcement pieced together the evidence, it became clear that Bundy's crimes spanned several states, and a complex investigation began to unfold. The case against Bundy grew stronger with each passing day. In a pivotal moment, police linked him to the brutal murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach in Florida, the last of his known victims. Bundy was charged with her kidnapping, rape, and murder, and it was this case that eventually led to his conviction and death sentence. The investigation into Bundy's crimes not only relied on traditional detective work, but also on the emerging use of forensic science, which tied Bundy to his victims in ways that couldn't be denied.
When it came time for Bundy's trial, the drama intensified. Bundy, ever the manipulator, chose to represent himself in court. This decision was a pivotal moment in the legal proceedings. Bundy's self-representation allowed him to control the narrative in the courtroom, manipulating both the media and the jury. As a former law student, he was confident in his ability to use legal jargon and tactics to his advantage, even though he lacked the professional skills of a seasoned lawyer. His decision to take charge of his defense, however, was also a double-edged sword. While it gave him the opportunity to manipulate the proceedings, it also exposed his lack of legal expertise and his tendency to act in his own self-interest.
During the trial, Bundy's behavior was a mix of confidence, defiance, and occasional desperation. He often used his charm to sway the public perception, maintaining an air of civility even as the evidence against him piled up. He cross-examined witnesses, attempted to challenge evidence, and even attempted to manipulate the jury's perception of him. However, as the trial progressed, Bundy's behavior grew more erratic. His arrogance started to crumble under the weight of the overwhelming evidence, and his carefully crafted image began to fall apart. His defense tactics, though manipulative, ultimately failed in the face of the facts. On July 24, 1979, Bundy was convicted of the murder of Kimberly Leach, and the jury sentenced him to death.
As the years went by, Bundy's attempts to delay his execution became more desperate. His legal team filed multiple appeals, and Bundy himself continued to try to manipulate the system from his death row cell. He admitted to more murders, but always with the intent of bargaining for more time. Bundy's final days were filled with legal maneuvering, but each attempt to delay his execution was quickly rejected. His once unstoppable charm and cunning had no effect on the judicial system now. On the morning of January 24, 1989, Bundy's fate was sealed. The day began with the usual routine, but for Bundy, there was no escaping the finality of his situation. He was offered a standard last meal, a meal that would serve as the final symbol of his life. Bundy's choice was a simple one: a steak cooked medium rare, eggs over easy, toast with butter and jelly, milk, and juice. Though the meal was typically elaborate for many death row inmates, Bundy chose simplicity, but he barely touched the food. Whether it was due to the anxiety of what was coming or the weight of his impending death, Bundy had little appetite left. At 7 a.m., Bundy was escorted from his death row cell and led to the execution chamber. He appeared calm but visibly nervous. Witnesses later described him as trying to maintain a stoic demeanor, though his fear was evident. As Bundy was strapped into the electric chair, a solemn silence fell over the room. He was positioned in front of witnesses, prison officials, journalists, and a few of his victims' family members who had come to witness the end of a man who had terrorized their lives for so long. Bundy's mother, Louise, had chosen not to attend the execution, respecting Bundy's wishes that she not endure the agony of watching her son die.
When asked if he had any final words, Bundy looked at his attorney and spiritual advisor and said, "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." His final words were brief, yet they marked the end of a life that had taken so many. The executioner then pulled the switch, and Bundy was struck with 2,000 volts of electricity, sending him into a violent seizure. Witnesses reported that Bundy's body tensed and contorted, but the end came quickly, within minutes. At 7:16 a.m., Ted Bundy was pronounced dead, ending a chapter in American criminal history. The news of Bundy's death sent shockwaves through the country. Some celebrated the end of his reign of terror, while others grappled with the moral questions surrounding his execution. For the families of his victims, Bundy's death marked the conclusion of a long, painful chapter, but it would never erase the scars he had left on their lives. His execution, though final, did little to undo the devastation he had caused. The impact of his crimes would linger, but for now, justice had been served. The end of Ted Bundy's life marked a significant moment in American history, one that left deep emotional and societal impacts across the nation. As Bundy's execution drew closer, the fear that had gripped communities for years began to dissipate. His reign of terror, spanning multiple states and involving the brutal murders of at least 36 women, had instilled a profound sense of vulnerability across the country, particularly among women. Bundy's ability to appear trustworthy, even charming, made him an even more terrifying figure as he exploited society's basic assumptions about safety and human decency. His death brought a sense of relief, though tinged with the knowledge that such a monster had walked among them for so long.
For the families of Bundy's victims, the impact was immeasurable. While some may have felt a sense of closure in his sentencing and execution, many found themselves grappling with lifelong grief. Their loved ones' lives had been stolen, and no execution could bring them back. The fact that Bundy never fully confessed to all of his crimes and his manipulative behavior during his final moments left many victims' families frustrated and disillusioned. For some, Bundy's death did not offer the closure they desperately sought. It was a painful reminder of the ongoing suffering they would endure without their loved ones. Bundy's execution also sparked intense debate across the nation, with opinions split on whether justice had truly been served. For some, Bundy's death was seen as the rightful conclusion to the horror he had inflicted on so many families. They viewed his execution as a necessary form of justice, an end to the terror that had gripped the country for over a decade. Others, however, questioned the morality of the death penalty itself, using Bundy's execution as a focal point in discussions about its ethical implications. Was the death penalty truly a form of justice, or did it perpetuate a cycle of violence? In the aftermath, the societal impact of Bundy's crimes lingered. Law enforcement, having learned painful lessons from his ability to evade capture for so long, re-examined how they approached serial killer investigations. The fear Bundy created led to greater awareness and preventative measures as women became more cautious and vigilant. While Bundy's execution brought a sense of finality, the ripple effects of his actions would continue to influence American society and the criminal justice system for years to come.